Hello, this is the second lecture for Law and Ethics that is covering ethical decision making. The objectives for this lecture presentation are to be introduced to Kitchener's model of moral principles, to consider means of promoting the moral principles in therapy, and to identify the steps involved in working through an ethical dilemma. So how do we make decisions in therapy? We'll be faced with several different decisions in therapy. Some of them are prescribed by law, some are guided by ethical codes, others are informed by standards of the profession, meaning what are therapists expected to do, but many others are grounded in a dilemma that have no clear-cut rules or steps. And in these situations, we're left to evaluate the situation, consider the law and ethical codes, make a determination, and justify that decision. With that, it can be helpful to distinguish between the different kinds of actions that we may be making in the therapy room. These can be split into two main categories: mandatory actions and discretionary actions. Mandatory actions are those that are derived primarily by law or from the law, and they include obligations and prohibitions. Obligations are things that we must do, and prohibitions are things that we must not do. For example, an obligation in therapy is that we must obtain informed consent. There's a law that tells us we have to do that. A prohibition, we must not have sex with clients. This is illegal. Now, discretionary actions have a variety of options. This is where things like values from our previous lecture come into play, the gray area of legal and ethical issues. One example would be accepting gifts. Do you accept a gift or not? There's no law that says you must or you must not, and the ethical codes are a bit vague. So it really comes down to your values, your clinical judgment, and that client's characteristics. We'll get more into that later. So here's an example from everyday life: taxes. So for taxes, we have an obligation. We must file and pay taxes if you owe money. A prohibition: you must not use someone else's identity. It's against the law. And a discretionary, where you get to choose: do you file yourself or do you go to a tax professional? That's a choice you can make. And there are pros and cons associated with both. Okay. So in order to help us to try to make decisions when we're faced with an ethical dilemma, we have what are called the moral principles, okay? Because most ethical codes tend to be reactive rather than proactive, it's up to us to have proactive plans for making ethical decisions. Again, most ethical codes most ethical codes are reactive, meaning that they are in response to something that's happened, as opposed to being proactive, where they're planning ahead for things that might happen. So these principles, the 5 principles that I'm going to go over with you, can serve to guide your decision-making in the therapy room and are consistent with our ethical codes. The first is autonomy. Autonomy basically says that all people have the right to make decisions and act on them in an independent fashion. This means acknowledging the right of your client to choose and to act in accordance with their own wishes and values, even when you disagree or when you know it's not a good decision. We can support autonomy as clinicians by not making decisions for our clients. We encourage them to make their own. We can also support autonomy by developing goals collaboratively, meaning that the client gets say into what they're going to work on in therapy. We can also help our clients to consider the positive and negative consequences that may occur based on the decisions that they're making. And we do this in a non-judgmental or biased manner. Justice is the second moral principle, and justice states that all individuals should be treated fairly. We want to provide appropriate services to all clients that we come into contact with. Note that this doesn't mean treating all clients the same. because clients have diverse and specific needs that may require different approaches. It just means being fair. However, one thing to keep in mind, if you are treating an individual client differently than the norm, you need to be able to offer a rationale that explains the necessity and appropriateness of treating this individual differently. For example, if you're going to provide office hours that are in the evening for a particular client, but not for other clients, you need to have something to back your decision to show why that's fair and appropriate and just. And that's pretty simple to do. For example, if that client works a 9-to-5 job and can only come to therapy after they get home or out of work at 5, then that makes sense and you're providing an accommodation for them. Next is beneficence. This involves actively making an attempt to benefit our clients in a positive manner. We can support beneficence by preventing harm whenever possible. For example, reporting child abuse or completing suicide assessments. We can also be proactive by helping our clients consider possible negative outcomes. So something like preparing them for the worst and hoping for the best. We can also link our clients to helpful resources that could provide a benefit, like support groups, for example. And finally, we can provide psychoeducation about what they're experiencing to help normalize their struggles and help them feel that they're not alone. One thing to remember in this case is, even though we may be operating with good intentions, they may not always follow through and end up being good, right? So think, for example, if you're trying to promote autonomy and independence in a client, and this client happens to be Japanese, if that promotion of autonomy involves having the client learn to be more assertive with their parent, the reality is that although this had good intentions, it might and very likely will damage the parent-child relationship. And so we need to keep in mind things like culture and diversity and try to really think through what some of the outcomes might be of our interventions, and know that even though our intentions are good, things still may go awry. Okay, non-malfeasance is at the opposite end of that spectrum. This involves avoiding causing harm to our clients. We can avoid causing harm, first off, by not causing intentional harm. So we don't insult our clients, criticize them, make fun of them. This includes talking negatively about a client with a colleague or a family member. Those things all have the potential to do harm. We want to definitely avoid dual relationships that can harm the client, such as a romantic relationship that exploits them. We want to avoid exploitation of clients. For example, if your client has met their goals and you just want to continue seeing them because they pay you $300 an hour, that's exploitation, and that could be doing harm and very likely is. So we want to avoid that. An interesting thing that comes up with this particular moral principle is diagnosis. So traditional diagnostic practices might be inappropriate for certain cultural groups. So if you as the therapist assign a diagnosis to a client based on a behavior that you judge to be abnormal, such as being very guarded or not being very forthcoming about things related to their life or their family life, and you say, well, then they have this particular mental health disorder, these behaviors could very well be culturally appropriate for this client. And by diagnosing them with something and pathologizing them in that way, without taking their culture into consideration, you could be doing harm by assigning a label and bringing stigma. So it's kind of complex. All right, the last one is fidelity. And fidelity is essentially a commitment to keep our promises, uphold truth, and maintain loyalty. Okay? We want to remain consistent with the standards of the profession. When you think about a therapist, the person that likely comes to mind is someone who's going to be trustworthy, who's going to be non-judgmental, who's going to be open and actively listen, And all of those pictures that you have of the therapist, your client also has, right? There's an idea of what a therapist is supposed to be. So fidelity involves being that person that is non-judgmental and keeps things confidential and actively listens and all of those things, right? So we can support fidelity by maintaining confidentiality, by maintaining professionalism regarding our space. So for example, being on time to sessions, being prepared for sessions, listening and not falling asleep during sessions, and so on. And by following through with what we say we're going to do. If we tell a client, the next time I see you, I'm going to bring some resources for substance use treatment, and then you forget, this is poor follow through, and the client may be learning that you can't be trusted. So that's important. Okay, so those are the 5 moral principles. Remember that they're helping us to make up for the fact that our ethical codes tend to be really reactive. So we're trying to have a more proactive approach to promoting the well-being of our clients. Next, I'm going to provide you with a model of ethical decision-making that can help you when you encounter an ethical dilemma and is going to incorporate ethics, laws, standard of the profession, and the moral principles into making these decisions. So step 1, identify the problem or the dilemma. You want to gather all the pieces of the puzzle here, all the relevant information. You want to determine, is this an ethical issue, a legal issue, a clinical issue, a cultural issue, professional, moral, or a combination of all of them, right? So for example, something like homicidal ideation, that's a legal issue. There's a law about that, right? But there are other components that may be professional, like how do you go about reporting that type of situation? So you have to kind of consider that, and that's going to guide you as to what type of advice you need. You want to perhaps consider multiple perspectives. It can be helpful to look at the problem from multiple perspectives and avoid relying on a simple solution. So to work through these, we're going to consider gifts. Remember I said we're going to come back to that. So let's consider that a client has given you a gift, a $50 gift card to your favorite restaurant, okay? So in this case with gifts, as I mentioned, there's no relevant law. There's no law that says you can or cannot accept a gift, but there is an ethical code, okay? And we're going to get to that in a little bit. This particular issue of accepting a gift is then an ethical and a clinical issue, right? Because it's going to affect the therapeutic relationship. Whether or not you accept the gift, it's going to do something clinically. So it's clinical. So ethical, there's an ethical code. Clinical, it's going to affect the relationship. And cultural, what do gifts mean to this person, right? Gifts might mean something really, really big and powerful and meaningful to this person based on their culture, or they might not. So we have a 3-pronged issue here: ethical, clinical, cultural, okay? You want to consider perspectives, as I mentioned here. So what is your perspective? Well, you may be thinking, $50 gift card to my favorite restaurant, that sounds great. I'm not paid enough for my job anyway, right? And you have to consider the client's perspective. What does accepting or not accepting the gift mean to the client? Okay, so this is the problem. Step 2, identify the potential issues involved. List and describe the critical issues and discard the irrelevant ones. Okay? So this would be kind of diving deeper into the problems that we identified in 1. What's the cultural context? What are the moral principles that matter here? You might want to involve your client in exploring the potential issues. I'm going to hone in on the moral principles piece. So which moral principles apply? First, beneficence. Will it benefit the client if you accept the gift? That's a real question. It might, okay? Especially if culturally this is really meaningful. Okay. Non-malfeasance. Can it harm the client if you take it? You might be thinking no, but potentially. Will the client think that they need to bring you a gift to every session now because you took this one? Are you exploiting your client's trust of you to get gifts like this? Will you confuse the client about the state of your relationship? Are you now friends because they gave you a gift? Right? So some potential harm. Justice. Would you accept a gift like this from your other clients? And Fidelity, what would other therapists in your position do? What are the standards of the profession in this case? So a lot of things to consider. Notice I haven't given you an answer to anything yet, but this is part of the process, things to consider. Step 3, ethical codes. Remember I said there's an ethical code about gifts. It comes from AMPT and it's code 3.9. It says marriage and family therapists attend to cultural norms when considering whether to accept gifts from or give gifts to clients. MFTs consider the potential effects that receiving or giving gifts may have on clients and on the integrity and efficacy of the therapeutic relationship. So this tells us, doesn't give us an answer, but it tells us we need to consider culture and we need to consider the ramifications of accepting or not accepting the gift and use that to inform our decision. Okay, so now we've added another layer to what we need to do to figure out what to do here. What we need to do to figure out what to do. All right, step 4, know the applicable laws and regulations. Which laws, if any, apply to the case? I mentioned at the beginning, there's no laws about this one, so we can bypass step 4. Step 5, obtain consultation. Consultation is super important. It can help you to uncover ideas that you haven't considered and help you to gain objectivity. Okay, having another set of eyes is going to help you to think about different ideas, different solutions, and help you to remain objective even when you potentially really want that $50 gift card. So consult with the appropriate people. As trainees, always clinical supervisor. If you have an ethical dilemma, consult with your clinical supervisor. If it's a legal issue, perhaps you're going to consult with legal counsel. If it's a cultural issue, there are cultural liaisons you can turn to. There are books perhaps you can read. If it's an ethical issue or potentially a legal issue, AMPT and CAMPT have consultation lines that you have access to with your membership. And then if it's a reporting issue, perhaps you're going to consult with CPS or APS. Okay. Number 6, consider the courses of action. Okay. This is basically brainstorming. Now that you know all the different layers, the laws, the ethics, the morals, the values, the consultation, the perspectives, start to brainstorm multiple options for dealing with the situation. Be creative, think about all possible options you can. Don't forget to consider that perhaps no action is what needs to be done here. In the case of the gift, you can't just ignore that they give you a gift, so that doesn't apply. But in some cases, not acting is a decision, and it could be the appropriate one. Number 7, consider the possible consequences of the decisions that you have on the table. I personally like these 3 tests. First, the test of justice, okay? This basically involves asking yourself, would you treat others the same in this situation? So if you take the gift from this client, will you take gifts from all your other clients too? If the answer is no, you might need to pick a different option. Note that in this case, if you're taking culture into consideration, accepting a gift from this client, but maybe not others, might still be appropriate. It just depends. Test of publicity. If your behavior was reported in the press, therapist accepts $50 Outback Steakhouse gift card, would you be okay with it? Or would you be ashamed? That's a good way to kind of test your decision. And then third, test of universality. If another therapist came to you and said, listen, Sally Sue, this client of mine gave me this $50 gift card for my favorite restaurant. Do you think I should take it? What would you say? The decision that you're planning on taking or considering taking should be one that you could recommend to a fellow clinician. If it's not, probably not a good idea. All right, step 8, choose what appears to be the best course of action and do it. So pick an action and do it. Follow up with the client, with your supervisor, to assess whether your actions had the desired outcomes, and document your choice carefully. Your documentation is your protection. Now, regardless of what you pick, remember that your hindsight doesn't invalidate the decision you made with the information you had at the time. So if you accept this gift from the client and you process it with them, and it's fine, and you move on, and later you find out that this client gave you a gift because they're in love with you, that doesn't mean that you made this fatal error, right? Because you made a decision based on what you knew at the time. okay? You would need to move forward and now process this new information, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have failed and you did a horrible thing, okay? All right, so we're gonna consider a case here. I'll read it out for you, and we'll talk about a couple things. So Jane is a counselor who primarily sees people with HIV or other chronic conditions. Local organizations and clinics often refer individuals with mental health issues to Jane. She recently received a call from an agency referring a man named Spencer because the staff was concerned about possible suicidality. Spencer makes an appointment and Jane gives him her standard intake paperwork. At the start of the session, she states, "I noticed you didn't sign the informed consent form. Do you have some questions or concerns you would like to discuss before we begin?" Spencer replies that he wants to know what she means by the statements regarding her possibly breaking confidentiality or taking some course of action if she is concerned that he may hurt himself or others. As Jane begins her standard explanation about the limits of confidentiality, Spencer interrupts and says that he believes it is his right to decide whether to live or die, and that if she cannot accept that, then she should just refer him to someone who will be more respectful of his values. So before we move on to some true or false questions that I have, let's identify the problem. In this case, the problem seems to be related to beliefs about right to die and potential legal obligations regarding suicide or ethical obligations regarding suicide. And there seem to be some ethical considerations related to autonomy, client autonomy, and right to choose. And we could get more specific into that in part 2 by adding in multiple layers like HIV status, considering Jane's culture, if we knew what that was, and Spencer's, and so on. Next, the ethical codes. What are the ethical codes here? Well, our ethics tell us that we prevent harm, so suicide is an issue here, and that we assess for suicide. And then we also have the ethical codes related to autonomy and allowing clients to make their own choice. And then ethical codes related to confidentiality and making sure our client understands it and agrees with it before signing informed consent. Next, laws. So laws that come into play here are primarily those related to consent and situations where you would breach confidentiality. So it sounds like she was trying to get at that already. Next, consultation. Who might you consult with? Definitely would consult with your clinical supervisor if you were Jane, and potentially camped or amped regarding this particular case and what they would recommend. What are some courses of action? Well, you could refer them out. You could process this in session. You could hospitalize them because you think they're a risk to themselves. You could assess for suicide. You could do nothing. So let's kind of consider a few things here that might influence your decision before you pick one. Okay. Oh, here are the steps that I just went over. So yeah, here we go. True or false? Because Spencer is currently competent and has asserted his right to do as he wishes with his life, Jane is not legally or ethically required to take action if she believes that Spencer plans to kill himself. So take a minute, think true or false. Okay, so the answer here is false. Jane is ethically required to at least assess for suicide and to make reasonable attempts to prevent harm, even though Spencer is competent and wants to exert his autonomy. Second question, true or false? A counselor may be sued for malpractice if he or she neglects to take action to prevent harm when the client is likely to commit suicide, yet the counselor is also liable if he or she overreacts by taking actions that violate a client's privacy when there's not a justifiable basis for doing so. This is a bit of a complicated question. It's got 2 parts to it. I'm going to read it one more time. A counselor may be sued for malpractice if he or she neglects to take action to prevent harm when a client is likely to commit suicide. Second part, yet the client is also liable if he or she overreacts by taking actions that violate a client's privacy when there's not a justifiable basis for doing so. So take a minute, true or false. Okay, in this case, it is true. So you can be sued for malpractice if you do not take action to prevent harm. Note that we're not saying here that you have to prevent somebody from committing suicide. You can't always do that, but you do need to take reasonable action. And this is where assessment for suicide comes into play. You would need to do a thorough assessment and document that assessment. And if the risk is high enough, intervene. And then the second part, you're also liable if you overreact. If you do your suicide assessment and the client doesn't have a plan or a means to follow through with suicide, and it's kind of just something they're thinking about, and you then go and issue an involuntary hold, this is excessive, right? We want to take the least restrictive option. And we're going to talk a lot more about suicide and assessment and ethical and legal requirements later. But I just want you to think about kind of this multifaceted issue here. So the answer here is true. Okay. Oops. So with that in mind, in my opinion, given the situation, given all of the layers, given the ethical, legal, moral considerations, it seems like the best course of action here would be to process what the client meant through his statement in a non-judgmental way, and probably, most likely, complete a suicide assessment and see if Spencer really does have an intent, plan, and means to follow through with killing himself, and if so, intervening. If not, it might just be something that needs to get processed and worked through therapeutically, a clinical issue, but you wouldn't know if you don't discuss it and assess. All right, so that is the end of this lecture. That concludes this one for you. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.